friends. So, I'm not a journalist by any means. I'm really just a nobody who has an interest in ending war and ending imperialism and addressing some other forms of discrimination, and in particular, veganism. I like to talk about veganism. And I do speculation because I'm not any sort of journalist of any kind. I do speculation and I sometimes connect the dots. And you're probably aware of the recent Gulf of Oman incident, which is just a train of different incidences that where people point the finger. The US government points the finger at Iran, that Iran is sabotaging oil tankers, like the 4 oil tankers a few weeks ago, and now in the Gulf of Oman, there's a couple of oil tankers one is a Japanese oil tanker. It gets to the point with me, and I'm sure it probably does with you if you follow independent journalists, and past actions are the best predictors of future actions in the case of US empire, and it has a long history of meddling in governments and overthrowing democratically elected governments, 50 plus, some say 81, since 1946. Some successful, some not. In the case of Iran in 1953, when they overthrew Mossadegh and installed the Shah, this is the US, then the Iranian people threw out the Shah, and they've never been forgiven for that by the US, the unsuccessful overthrowing of their government. And they've basically been vilified ever since that time by the US and by Israel and by Saudi Arabia, the 3 partners in crime. What I like to put back on them, the axis of evil, or the troika of tyranny, as John Bolton likes to call any country that hasn't submitted to them. Well, I like to throw that back at them. So anyway, so this Gulf of Oman incident, the foreign minister of Iran said when he heard of this, this is on Twitter, reported attacks on Japan-related tankers occurred while Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was meeting with Ayatollah Khomeini for extensive and friendly talks. Suspicious doesn't begin to describe what likely transpired this morning. Iran's proposed regional dialogue forum is imperative. It was June 13th, Javad Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran, he's a very intelligent man, and he has done, you can look up numerous talks by him or discussions with him by various, sort of YouTube channels, and it's very interesting to listen to him. Trita Parsi said, so literally while Japan's Abe is meeting with Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini, a Japanese oil tanker is attacked in the Gulf of Oman. Sounds like some are afraid Japan may succeed in starting diplomacy. The message appears to be, don't you dare stand in the way of my war plans. So that was Trita Parsi. I'm sorry, I forget. He's actually sort of, I think, a scholar of Iranian history or something. I don't know. But anyway, he has some interesting insights on his Twitter page. CENTCOM put out this interesting little paragraph, which I was surprised at. There's a few surprises here in the... It's actually a bit confusing because they've sent a destroyer to the Gulf of Oman since this happened, and there's been speculation that it could be Israel who has done this sabotage of these oil tankers. Saudi Arabia always likes to blame Iran, and Saudi Arabia has been saying that it's the Houthis, although the Houthis are sort of blockaded in Yemen, so not sure how they could do it, and also it's too sophisticated for them. I think for that to happen, I think it required torpedoes from a submarine. So that's ridiculous, but let's blame the Houthis, and they always like to say that Iran is funding or linked to the Houthis. I think they are friendly with the Houthis, but I don't think they're necessarily supporting them. And as you know, Saudi Arabia has there's an ongoing genocide in Yemen, a US-backed Saudi genocide of Yemenis, and at the present time it's like 1 child dies every 10 minutes from disease and famine, and 2, I think it's like 2 mothers die every 10 minutes, from in childbirth or something. Or is it every hour? I don't know, but anyway, it's a terrible situation in Yemen that is not really, it's not really abating at all. And the US, as I understand, is still involved in that. So, but anyway, and so Saudi Arabia likes to blame the Houthis because the Houthis are actually fighting against this genocide that's happening in Yemen. They're trying to fight against Saudi Arabia. So anyway, the CENTCOM said something which was interesting. We have no interest in engaging in a new conflict in the Middle East. We will defend our interests, but a war with Iran is not in our strategic interest, nor in the best interest of the international community. I guess they haven't been talking to John Bolton lately. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what this means, and it seems to be in contrast to John Bolton, who's been talking about invading Iran well, basically he's happy invading anybody. He's invasion happy, and he's been talking about invading and destroying Iran for, I don't know, at least a couple of decades. He's even written a blog about it. This is John Bolton. So, I don't know, maybe they haven't compared notes. But anyway, we won't take much notice of that. Back to Javed Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister. He said that the US immediately jumped to make allegations against Iran without a shred of factual or circumstantial evidence. Only makes it abundantly clear that the B team, he calls them the B team, I think it's Bibi Netanyahu, Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, and who's the other one? John Bolton, maybe, is moving to Plan B, sabotage diplomacy, including by Shinzo Abe, the Japanese Prime Minister, and cover up its economic terrorism against Iran. As you know, that the US has very, very heavy economic sanctions on Iran, and if you know what's been happening in Venezuela with the crippling economic sanctions by the US, there's been 40,000 Venezuelans have died since 2017 due to the US crippling sanctions. So the US in many ways is carrying out a genocide in Venezuela by continuing on and increasing these economic sanctions in Venezuela. So much for their going on as usual. They're doing this for Venezuelans for freedom and democracy, and yet they're actually killing them by the tens of thousands with their economic sanctions, and they know it. And so they've also got heavy economic sanctions on Iran, and that's also causing a lot of problems with civilians, obviously, in Iran. It's affecting them very badly. But the US doesn't care about that. It's an act of war, economic sanctions. So they're quite happy to do that. And I mean, the economic sanctions that the US put on Iraq in the early 90s, 500,000 children died due to those economic sanctions. And when the Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, was later asked, was that worth it? She thought it was worth it. So they really have no finer feelings for anybody in any country. As the US has stated, Washington has stated, we have interests, we don't have allies. Really, when we just sacrifice human rights for their own interests. They've literally said that. Ben Norton is from the Grey Zone Project, has actually written, he's a journalist, a really great journalist, and he's written this very, very clear, he has this great way of condensing all the information and in sort of easy to read. It's not too dense. And he's written a very good article titled Trump Admin Aims to Kill Historic Talks and Strangle Iran with Evidence-Free Accusations. And I'll just read you a little bit of it, and I'll post a link in the information section. Before I go on to it, I just wanted to say that the US is just going to keep doing all these little sabotage acts via proxies, either with Israel or Saudi Arabia, and accusing Iran of it until and they'll sort of become more and more pronounced. They'll become more and more serious until they have enough of a sort of history and a collection of false flags that they can go, okay, well, now we have the ability to say we're going to invade Iran. Now, as I was and they've been planning this ever since Trump got into office. In particular, Trump has always talked about Iran and vilified Iran, and his benefactor for his presidential election, Sheldon Adelson, has always had a thing about Iran. He's a big pro-Israel supporter, and Israel wants Iran out of the picture. Basically, Israel wants a whole lot of managed chaos systems all throughout the Middle East. It doesn't make them look so bad when they have a lot of extreme, there's a lot of chaos. And, and Pompeo, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, believes in the rapture, which means, that, ironically, it means that, that basically it's an anti-Semitic kind of a belief system. But he believes in the rapture, so, Iran has to be out of the picture and all that kind of thing. Anyway, as I was saying about Adelson, he actually provided millions and millions of dollars to Trump for his presidential election, and the way to pay Sheldon Adelson back is, and also Sheldon Adelson actually funds a lot of the GOP as well. So, Trump this is payback time, and Trump is sort of, in some ways, if he invades Iran, then that is a payback to Sheldon Adelson. So anyway, the other thing I was going to say is that the mainstream media, interestingly, hasn't been doing the usual thing like they did with Iraq, with the lie of weapons of mass destruction, how they all got on board and they were touting that lie like for all they were worth, to manufacture consent so that the Bush administration then decided to invade Iraq. But this time, interestingly, they haven't been so much jumping on that. Of course, they've been reporting without any sort of asking questions. They've just been reporting, and sort of and implying things. But most of them have been saying things like Pompeo has been accusing Iran, but there is no evidence of Iran attacking those 2 oil tankers. So that's an interesting turnabout. I don't know why that is. I'm not sure why they've thrown that in, because usually they're completely uniform and they just go with whatever the national security state wants them to go with. It's almost like they're sent out their talking points. So that's an interesting thing. I'm not sure why that is. It would be great if they didn't just go on their usual hell-bent thing of helping the national security state eventually invade Iran by just promoting the lies of the administration. But I know that you just know the minute I saw that thing about the Gulf of Oman, I just immediately thought of the Gulf of Tonkin. That was a false flag that helped start the Vietnam War. And it's impossible now for me to just anything where even when I see a conflict in a country that suddenly happens, I just immediately think, I wonder where the US is involved in this, or sometimes it's very obvious that they are. But it always ends up pretty much that if there's some sort of a major unrest that happens somewhere either in the history of that country, the US has been meddling, or they're currently meddling with proxies and whatever, or funding, people in that country to whatever. It's or Saudi Arabia, like for example the Sudan massacre just recently, where 100 pro-democracy protesters were killed by the military. The Saudis, I think, have been funding. The Saudis are connected with that and want to keep the military in power in that country. They don't want a civilian democracy. They want to keep the military in power because Sudan supplies 9,000 soldiers who are often on the front lines in Yemen. And they're on the front lines usually, and a lot of them are child soldiers too. So the Saudis use the Sudanese, 9,000 Sudanese, to help them with this genocide in Yemen and to fight the Houthis. So they don't want a civilian. They don't want a democracy there. They want the military to keep in power so that they can keep supplying these their Sudanese army to help to help in Yemen. So they just went ahead and massacred those pro-democracy demonstrators, which is really, really awful. Anyway, back to this essay by Ben Norton. Sorry I get a bit sidetracked and I meander around. Sorry I don't have talking points in front of me, and sometimes things come to mind and I just meander around. It's sort of what I tend to do. I hope it doesn't drive you crazy. Anyway, so Ben Norton says, hell-bent on isolating and suffocating Iran, the Trump administration derailed Japan's historic talks by accusing Tehran, without any evidence whatsoever, of attacking oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman. Since entering office, the Donald Trump administration has been itching for a war on Iran, and it may have found an excuse to justify an escalation of military aggression, or at least kill independent international attempts at diplomacy with Iran. On the morning of Thursday, June 13th, 2 oil tankers were allegedly attacked in the Gulf of Oman, just off the coast of Iran. The US government immediately blamed Iran for the incident without providing any evidence. The vessels happened to be en route to Japan at precisely the same time that Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was in Tehran, the first Japanese leader to visit Iran since its revolution 40 years ago. Abe was holding a historic meeting with Ayatollah al-Khamenei when the incident took place. This coincidence did not escape Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, who said, and I've read that out to you before, basically. Prominent Iran expert Trita Parsi, oh there you go, that's the person I was mentioning, Trita Parsi, noted that the timing of the suspicious attack suggests that there is a fear in Washington that efforts at Iran-Japan diplomacy might succeed in softening the de facto US-led economic blockade of Tehran. Since Trump illegally sabotaged the international Iran nuclear deal, known officially as the JCPOA, in May 2018, the US government has striven to isolate Iran and suffocate its economy by preventing the country from exporting oil, importing food and medicine, and trading with foreign nations. The Trump administration has even threatened close ally Japan, the world's 4th largest consumer of oil, with secondary sanctions forcing the country to halt Iranian imports. Concerns that the Trump administration has been fretting about potential Iranian diplomatic breakthrough with Japan were validated by the US response. Secretary of State and former CIA Director Mike Pompeo immediately pointed the finger at Tehran, calling the alleged attacks, quote, a threat to international peace and security, a blatant assault on the freedom of navigation, and an unacceptable escalation of tension by Iran, end quote. Saudi Arabia and its regime media went into overdrive, amplifying the Trump administration's accusations against Iran. Many Western corporate media outlets, too, lazily echoed the US government's unsubstantiated claims. The New York Times, for example, published a breaking piece. Headline, Pompeo says intelligence points to Iran in tanker attack in the Gulf of Oman. Actually, I didn't see that about the New York Times. I'm sorry to hear. I'm not surprised. But I'm sorry, I thought I'd actually seen a few reports where they weren't so quickly jumping to that. But, you know, it's no surprising the New York Times and others would do that anyway, because that's what they do. They're just propaganda arms of the national security state, really. Anyway, the Times did concede, however, that Pompeo did not present any evidence to back up the assessment of Iran's involvement. And several mainstream media outlets actually diverged from their traditional pro-war stances and expressed cautious skepticism about the Secretary of State's unproven accusations. Surprisingly, CNN, NPR, and The Independent stressed that Pompeo provided no evidence for his claims. Isn't that interesting? I find that interesting, and I wonder why. I wonder if they're just kind of doing that so because they got so much flack after the Iraq War and how they were all just banging the drums of war there, that maybe they, just for his history's sake, after Iran is invaded, they can say, well, you know, we were a bit cautious. Who knows? I don't know. Anyway, Iran's press TV outlet published video of what it said were crew members of one of the tankers who had been saved by an Iranian rescue team. The Iranian government-backed channel accused the Trump administration of exploiting incidents like this to, quote, to wage war, end quote. Press TV also tweeted photos of one of the tankers hours after the alleged attack, noting that the vessel was unharmed and the fire had been put out. Press TV actually is quite a good channel if you're on YouTube, if you check it out. They have some interesting guests, and it's sad, because there is so much vilification. There's been so much vilification for as long as I can remember about Iran, and it's purposeful because it helps to manufacture consent over decades that Iran is some sort of evil country that's has no reason to be suspicious or to dislike the United States. It's just they're just pure evil. They're evil because they enjoy being evil. That's sort of the thing that gets put out, really, either implied or explicit almost, or sometimes totally explicit, particularly by Christian fascists. And it just shows the maliciousness of propaganda. How it's like with veganism. If you target a group like non-human animals and you make them out to be lesser all the time, lesser and stupid and not worth it, and property and things and all of that, that eventually it's deeply embedded in people. Oh, well, animals are lesser, because they're different. And that's the power of discrimination, of speciesism in this case, and it's racism in the case of Iran. Constant messages of vilifying Iran and dehumanizing Iranians, and basically not even really even showing anything about what happens in Iran. A lot of people go to Iran and say it's such a wonderful experience and it's so friendly there. People are so friendly to them. Of course, the Iranian government has its problems, like any country. It certainly does. But it's not at all what the United States and other countries who have reasons, whether it's oil, because Iran is the fourth largest oil reserves in the world, and the Persian Gulf, a lot of, I think it's 30%, I think, of the world's oil goes in and out of the Persian Gulf. Is it 30%? And the US has been trying to crush Iran's oil exports, and that can be devastating economically, totally. But this vilification of Iran has been so dangerous, and sometimes I really wish, like, for example, there are countries like, for example, Russia. Russia has a lot of social media presence, and you constantly see them, either if it's through RT.com or if it's, they're constantly showing themselves and their country and what they think and all of this. And even though Press TV is really good and everything, but it doesn't have enough of the presence of I don't think anyway, of what the leaders think, and more of a presence so that it sort of, people get to see what Iran is like more, because that's the thing. It's sort of not given enough of a social media presence to actually push against that sort of like they're the center of all that's evil. Seriously, that's what's constantly put out there about it by some of the Western media and by some in Washington. Anyway, these facts nevertheless did not stop notorious war hawks and neoconservatives from beating the drum of war. Fanatical anti-Muslim activist Brigitte Gabrielle bizarrely described the incident as, quote, an attack on the United States, end quote. See, that is a purposeful incitement to violence. It's a purposeful incitement to violence. These people, I wonder, how do they sleep at night? People like her. Neoconservative commenter Michael Weiss, who has spent the past 8 years pushing for regime change in Syria, implied the alleged attacks are proof that Iran is a quote-unquote threat. Another warmonger. And it has tweets by him. And Marco Rubio, of course, he's continually trying to cause problems. If it's not Venezuela, it's Iran. He's a horror story. Anyway, I might leave you to check out the rest of that by Ben Norton, the rest in the Grey Zone Project. The Grey Zone Project is an excellent journalist resource with a lot of independent journalists. So check it out. It's very interesting. And there's only a few more paragraphs left. I won't read it out. There's part of it where it said on June 13th, the Ayatollah Khomeini reiterated that he rejected Trump's offer to discuss a new agreement, stating, quote, I do not consider Trump as a person worth exchanging any message with, end quote. And Trump is trying to dissuade President Abe from talking to Iran, because they don't want any sort of détente with anybody. They want everybody to be against them, they don't want peace, and so they want to try and put a spanner in the works of any diplomatic, it's the timing is amazing, really. If you've ever seen that cartoon where the coyote is trying to sabotage the roadrunner, the US reminds me of that, really. Except, of course, the US does sabotage a lot of people and does get away with it. But it's like they're becoming so obvious, such an obvious villain, I think, anyway. Maybe it isn't to the general public with all the propaganda that's out there. But for me, they're such an obvious villain that the minute I hear something like that, I immediately think, oh, God, what have they done now? I'll leave you with this thing by Max Blumenthal. He is always on the ball. And on Twitter, he said, remember the main Operation Northwoods, Gulf of Tonkin, Kuwaiti incubator babies, Saddam's WMDs, Gaddafi soldiers, Viagra spree, last messages from Aleppo, Douma, burning aid on Colombia Venezuelan bridge, and now today's attacks in the Gulf of Oman. And that's about it, really. When one can just look at all the false flags, it's really, really sad that we live in a world now where it's just one thing after another. Every day there's one more trying to warmonger and trying to invade some country. It's just, if it's not Venezuela, it's Iran. If it's not Iran, it's Syria. If it's not Syria, it's Russia, and on and on. Like the Pentagon recently put out something, the RAND Corporation, which is just like a deep state think tank that's been around since, I think, 1946, and they put out something about basically how to, destroy Russia. This is just sort of, I think, recently. They talk about how they need to change their game plan and all that. But, this is the thing. It's just like the US is just this rogue empire now that's constantly looking for countries to overthrow. And it won't be happy until it has. And it's like this particular administration, they're all as bad as one another, but this one, with John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, it's just he's constantly looking for trouble. And have you seen that? The Onion, they had a picture of John. The Onion is that satire page, and they had a picture of John Bolton with he had a knife in his shoulder or something, and he's hanging on to it, and he's basically hanging on to the corridors in the White House saying, Iran did it or something, and that's about the size of it. Anyway, please subscribe if you like the content. Please hit the notification bell. Otherwise you don't receive content. Please click the like button if you like the content. Please leave comments. I always enjoy your comments. So thanks so much for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Vega. Peace.